Hey everybody, it's me, happy Halloween! Anyway, so you guys opted to not have class tonight, and that's probably a smart idea, because I can't imagine the traffic mess downtown in Edwardsville right now. So, here is my lecture for the evening. It should be pretty quick and easy. This week we will be discussing, finally getting around to discussing, leading lines and framing. So, I know that I've pointed things out while you guys had done your other homework assignments when we did critiques and whatnot. So hopefully you guys kind of maybe have an idea of what some of these terms mean and how to take photos, but I'm going to go over a couple basic points just to make sure that you understand some of the rules and things to follow while taking the photos. Your assignment is up on Blackboard. And it's extremely vague, but hopefully it's just to kind of remind you what you're supposed to do. I may or may not change that so that it's more explanatory, but I think basically if you kind of listen to the lecture, you understand what you're supposed to do. You're going to be taking 5 photos, just like every other week, and you're going to be taking 2 different framing photos, 2 different leading line photos. And then for your 5th photo, I've thrown in a wild card, which is kind of self-explanatory. But I'd like you to go out and take a photograph of wildlife. It's just that simple. Go out and find something that lives in the wild and take a good photo of it where you fill the frame and it's nice and as close up as you can get and is a really decent photo. What I will warn you about, you do, for all of these photos, you really do need to utilize any editing skills that you can. If you cannot get it in camera, use your editing skills, especially cropping, to make things look right. With the wildlife, keep in mind that a lot of times I may get people who will say, oh, the only photo I could get was this bird that was, a mile away on a phone line, and basically the bird takes up, just like 2 pixels worth of the photo. You cannot crop into photos like that and expect to get a good result. You need to be relatively close, and your subject needs to take up as close to half of the overall frame as possible, and then you can crop in and things will look fine and they won't be super pixelated and gross looking. So keep that in mind when you're doing your wildlife photo, that you do need to either use your telephoto lens, use your optical zoom if you have a point-and-shoot camera, or physically get as close as you can to the animal as you can, safely, without scaring them off. Some things are like birds, ducks, geese, so if you go to some of the parks that have ponds or cemeteries that maybe have ponds, they might have geese. Squirrels count. I count bugs. Things like that count. The things I do not count are things that are domesticated. So farm animals, cats, dogs, pets, things like that. I do allow that if you want to go to the zoo, I do allow zoo photos. But some people don't want to go all the way over just to do homework for 1 photo. So it's up to you. Do what you can, but it needs to not be domesticated. Okay, so let's dive into framing for the first thing. So what you see here on my computer screen is my first example of framing. And you'll notice that it's basically a photo of a guy standing on rocks by the ocean, and it appears as though the photo was taken between like maybe pier legs or some kind of a structure's legs. First thing I want to point out is when it comes to framing, in order to create a frame, basically framing is kind of what it sounds like. We're going to create, usually you would put a photograph in a frame to hang on your wall. So it's basically some kind of a structure made of wood or metal that goes around 4 sides to help bring a viewer's eye's attention to a photograph on the wall. And we all know what frames are. We use them all the time to hang stuff on the wall. So within a photograph, when we talk about framing, it's kind of the same idea. We use one structure to frame another structure. Now, Usually when you have frames on the wall, they have 4 sides. When we talk about framing in photography, it doesn't have to be 4 sides. You can have 2 sides, or 3 sides, or 4 sides. So basically, if you do 2 sides, you can have them vertical on either side. You can have them horizontal across the top and bottom. Or in some photos, you can use one side on a vertical and one on a horizontal, and kind of make like an upside down shape, upside down L shape. What you need to do and try to keep in mind is you really want to try to keep your frame in focus as well as your subject matter that's inside the frame. And you'll notice, like with this, these dock legs are not really in focus. This is a good time to possibly utilize your aperture settings and use a larger aperture, a larger number aperture, which will keep your depth of field at a longer range. And then maybe step back away from your framing structure so that to the camera your frame and the thing inside your frame appear to be a little bit closer to each other, and that way you can keep things, you don't get such a shallow depth of field like we have here. So this isn't the best example of a frame, and I do that on purpose so that you can see. Try to keep your frame as in focus as possible. The other thing that this photograph illustrates is something over here. If you notice, the frame structure does not go all the way to the side. There's a little bit of a gap. We call that guttering, and you don't want to have guttering in your photo. You want your frames to completely cover the edge and then go into your photo. So we don't want to have this. So this is a time, if you take a photo that looks like this, and sometimes it's a little hard to avoid that in the field when you're working, so you can just come home and just use your cropping and just crop this. Make the photo just a little bit smaller, but crop in so that your photo goes all the way to the edge, or your frame goes all the way to the edge of your photo, so that you don't have this gap here. Okay? Next example here, we have an example of like using a window. So any kind of structure that's open that you can see through and that shows something interesting behind it can be used as a frame. So there's just an endless possibilities to the things you can use as frames. With this, the reason I have this photo, what I want to illustrate is this particular window kind of has an arch top to it. And sometimes you may see arched windows, you may see arched doorways, hallways, things like that, and that's what you want to use for your frame. And that's fine. You need to make sure that if for some chance you can't get all of the structure in your photo, like this one you can see the bottom of the window and as well as the top. If it's some kind of an arch or so, if you've got to cut anything off, cut the bottom part off. Try not to cut the top part off, because if you cut off part of an arch, it's going to really be annoying. So always try to keep the top of the arch as much as possible. You don't have to have a whole lot of space at the top, but you do need to keep that entire curve. And as you notice here, this frame and its subject matter are relatively in focus with each other. So this is a fantastic frame. I love this photo. With the next one here, a couple things. I love this photo, and you'll notice that the frame itself is relatively in focus, and then the thing that we're framing is in focus. The thing that bothers me is this top part here. So again, perfect example of how you should use your cropping skills to crop annoying things like this out. Down here, it kind of gradiates into lighter from darker, and that's not too annoying. But up here, having this stark line right here from dark to light just drives me nuts. So crop stuff like that out if you have to. Some people are kind of annoyed by the fact that this isn't perfectly centered, and some people have asked, do you need to utilize your rule of thirds if you're doing framing? And you don't have to. You can, but you don't have to. But if you're going to do rule of thirds, do rule of thirds. And if you're not going to do rule of thirds, then put stuff as much in center as you can. I'm not sure what was on this side that they cut that so short. There might have been, the wall might have ended over here and they had no choice. I don't know, but they maybe could have done a little more rule of thirds. Because this is kind of in this limbo between the middle and kind of on the rule of thirds. So some people, it drives them nuts, this photo. I love it, but it can put some people on edge. Okay, with this photo, we're using window panes to use as a frame. And this was taken at an angle. Whoever took it kind of at an angle. So you kind of notice no matter what you do, there's a little bit of perspective to these window panes. So it would be really hard to just cut just with this pane and keep it all without any guttering, because you notice like this line kind of slopes down a little bit. The one thing that you can do, if you have window panes, that's totally fine, but you need to try to have the extra space around the window pane be kind of equal. And obviously in this photo, it's not. We have this little sliver of window pane and windows here, and then we have a lot more around these three sides. And that's just kind of annoying to me. I think that just for, the sake of aesthetics, you should try to keep things relatively equal. Even though this was taken at an angle and we have some perspective, they maybe could have split the difference between the space and maybe had a little more space over here and a little less space over here and centered this just a little bit more. Now here we're using trees, and trees are a great way to do framing. Make sure that you use good cropping skills so that the trunk goes all the way to the side of the photo. And when I talk about the inverted L frame, where you have like something that goes along the side and then across the top, this photo doesn't really show it per se. I think there's another photo that's a bad example of how to do it, but you can use frames or use trees as frames, and trees make fantastic frames because there's just so much to them. But if you're going to do this, you have the trunk that goes up the side, and then you usually have some branches or whatnot that'll come across the top, and that can create a frame. If you're going to do that, make sure that the branches that come across the top cover at least 50% halfway across the top. I don't want one that ends like way over here. That's not really a frame. You want it to come as much as halfway or more as you can across the top. And you also want to make sure that it's not just one little twig. You want it to be a nice substantial branch. Like now, at this time of the year, we may or may not have trees that most of the leaves have fallen off, so you're not going to really have leaves to fill it in. But you don't want one sparse little twig. A nice, good branch with some other, like, smaller twig branches coming off, so that it has some substantial heft to it to go across the top. Okay, of course, you guys won't be finding palm trees and rocky desert outcrops like this one, but well, I'm sure we can find some things in our area that kind of look like this, just not palm trees. Now with this frame totally breaks all the rules in rhyme and reason. This is a totally unique type of frame, but it's a really cool frame and it does work. So if you happen to come across something like this, totally unique, it is a frame. We're framing the sun, and we're framing it in this nice spiral. I can't say, is this a, a 2-side, 3-side, 4-side frame, and obviously there's some guttering and things like that, but that's okay. This is one of the few times that you can kind of break the rules, and it's okay. It works that way. And then we have this photo here, and it's just an example of lovely framing with 2 trees. And you notice how, even though it's a little sparse in here, it's still substantial enough to create the illusion of kind of a top. And then here we have, you notice I want to point out with this photo, there is a little guttering here, but it is kind of dark. It's a little hard to see the guttering, so it's not as noticeable. But on this tree, the trunk goes all the way to the side, and we have one branch that goes more than halfway across. And this is kind of a little bit of a thin branch, but this one's probably borders on the thinnest acceptable size of a branch. So find something that has a little bit of heft to it that goes more than halfway across the top. So even if this tree was not on the side here, that would be totally fine. This would totally work, except for this one tree here drives me crazy because it's in the way. But this is a nice frame. Now, what's inside the frame is not as interesting to look at, in my opinion, and you want to try to make sure that you have things that are interesting to look at. But overall, it is a frame, and it's an example of using a tree with a bare branch as a frame. My video is about ready to cut out here, so I'm going to stop for here with framing, and I'm going to pick up in part 2 and talk about leading lines.